To the world, Van Johnson was the perfect American dream. A boyish smile, a clean-cut image, the face of hope during a wartime America, but behind that carefully crafted Hollywood illusion, Van Johnson lived a life built on silence, fear, and secrets that could have destroyed everything he worked for. In the 1940s, when America needed heroes, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer gave them Van Johnson. He wasn't the tough, unbreakable soldier. He was the everyman, gentle, approachable, emotional. Audiences trusted him, studios protected him, and millions believed they knew who he really was. But what if that image was never the whole truth? What if the man symbolizing wholesome masculinity in classic Hollywood was quietly hiding relationships that, if exposed, would have ended his career overnight? Van Johnson rose to stardom at a time when Hollywood enforced strict morality clauses. Being openly gay wasn't just unacceptable, it was career suicide. Studios controlled everything: public appearances, romantic rumors, even marriages. Survival meant obedience. Honesty meant disappearance. And Van Johnson understood that better than anyone. Years later, in rare private moments near the end of his life, Van Johnson reportedly broke decades of silence. He spoke quietly, carefully, and named the men he had loved in secret during Hollywood's golden age. Not for shock, not for scandal, but for truth. "I didn't have the luxury of being honest," he once admitted. In those days, honesty could destroy everything you worked for. This is not just the story of a movie star, it's the story of an entire generation forced to live double lives, of love hidden in shadows, and of a Hollywood that demanded perfection while quietly crushing the people who created it. And it all began long before the fame, long before the studio contracts, long before the secrets became a matter of survival. Long before the lights of Hollywood ever found him, Van Johnson's life was shaped by loss. He was born Charles Van L. Johnson on August 25, 1916, in Newport, Rhode Island. His childhood was not filled with privilege or glamour. When his father died, the weight of responsibility fell heavily on his mother, Loretta Snyder, a strong and determined woman who raised him largely on her own. She saw something in her son early on, not just talent, but sensitivity, a quiet, emotional depth that didn't always fit the expectations placed on young men of that era. As a teenager, Van gravitated toward music and theater. The stage offered him something real, a place where emotion was allowed, where vulnerability wasn't weakness, but power. Acting became more than a dream. It became an escape, a way to transform uncertainty into purpose. Still, the road forward was anything but easy. He moved to New York City with little money and no guarantees. Broadway didn't welcome him with applause. Instead, it gave him chorus roles, minor parts, and long stretches of doubt. The days were exhausting, the pay was unstable, and success always seemed just out of reach. But Van Johnson persisted. Night after night, rehearsal after rehearsal, he sharpened his craft, quietly, patiently, believing that something better had to be waiting. Those early years were humbling. They stripped away illusions and replaced them with discipline. What Van lacked in confidence, he made up for with determination. What he lacked in power, he compensated for with kindness and professionalism. People noticed, not because he demanded attention, but because he earned trust. Eventually, Hollywood scouts began to take interest. They saw the red hair, the open face, the natural warmth that felt effortless on a stage. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer believed they had discovered the perfect leading man, someone audiences could believe in, someone America could love. But what the studio didn't see or chose not to see was the quiet internal conflict already forming beneath the surface. Van Johnson was entering a system that demanded obedience, conformity, and silence. And he was about to learn that success in Hollywood often came at a deeply personal cost. The contract was signed, the transformation began, and the man named Charles Van L. Johnson slowly disappeared behind a studio-created image. When Van Johnson arrived at MGM, he wasn't immediately treated like a star. At first, he was placed in smaller roles, tested, shaped, and quietly observed, like raw material in a studio machine. MGM didn't just hire actors, they manufactured images. And Van Johnson's image was exactly what America needed. As World War II reshaped the country, audiences weren't looking for cynical heroes or hardened warriors. They wanted someone who felt human, someone who looked like the boy next door you could trust with your fears, your hopes, your prayers. Van Johnson became that face. He didn't play soldiers as invincible machines. He played them as men who could be scared, loyal, vulnerable, men shaped by friendship, sacrifice, and love. His clean-cut warmth hit the public like medicine during a time of national anxiety. He didn't intimidate the audience. He comforted them. And soon, MGM realized they had something priceless. Van Johnson wasn't just popular, he was bankable, a symbol, a studio asset, the kind of star you protect at all costs. Then, in 1943, everything nearly ended. During the filming of A Guy Named Joe, Van Johnson suffered a horrific accident. A falling camera crane struck his head, causing severe injuries that nearly killed him. Doctors feared he wouldn't survive. For a time, it wasn't even certain he would fully recover. His comeback was long, painful, and marked by permanent damage. Metal plates had to be implanted in his skull. The scars weren't just physical, they were emotional too. The kind you carry quietly, the kind you never fully explain. But here's what made the moment even more haunting. Instead of destroying his stardom, the public learned what had happened and loved him even more. The awareness of his suffering deepened their attachment. It made him feel even more real, even more precious. Van Johnson returned to the screen not only changed in appearance, but changed in the spirit. His performances gained a deeper sensitivity, like he had stared at death and come back carrying something heavier behind his eyes, and the timing couldn't have been more powerful. In the mid to late 1940s, Van Johnson reached the peak of his fame. Films like 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, Battleground, The Caine Mutiny, and In the Good Old Summertime showcased his range. He moved between war dramas, musicals, and romantic comedies with ease. On screen, he had embodied loyalty, moral strength, and emotional honesty. Audiences didn't just admire him, they trusted him. He felt like a brother, like a friend, like the kind of man you could count on. But while America embraced his image, the real Van Johnson was living with something much more complicated. Because behind that wholesome, all-American mask, the pressures were tightening. The studio system demanded conformity. It demanded appearances. It demanded that the stars never show anything that could make the public question the fantasy. And if Van Johnson had a private truth that didn't match MGM's perfect picture, then his survival would depend on silence. By the time Van Johnson married Eve Abbott on January 25th, 1947, he wasn't just an actor. He was one of MGM's most valuable stars, and MGM didn't simply protect Van Johnson's career. They protected his image like it was a national treasure. The public adored him for his wholesome charm, his easy smile, his boy-next-door warmth. To millions of fans, he looked like the perfect romantic leading man. So when news broke that he was getting married, Hollywood treated it like a fairy tale. The wedding was widely publicized, presented as proof that Van Johnson was exactly who audiences believed he was. The ideal all-American man settling into domestic bliss at the height of his fame. It wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a studio victory. Eve Abbott, a former stage actress, understood the entertainment world. She wasn't naive. She had poise, intelligence, and the kind of composure required to survive life under public scrutiny. On paper, they looked like a perfect match. To the public, they were the image of stability. And for a while, the family picture seemed complete. Their marriage produced one child, a daughter named Skylar, who became the emotional center of Van Johnson's family life. Friends and associates later recalled how devoted he was as a father, affectionate, protective, and genuinely present. Many believed that whatever complications existed behind closed doors, his love for his daughter was real and enduring. Through this marriage, Van also became a stepfather to Eva's two sons from a previous relationship, Edmund Keenan and Tracy Keenan Wynn. Tracy, in particular, would later find success as a screenwriter, contributing to films such as The Longest Yard. Van's role as a stepfather added another layer to the public story MGM wanted audiences to see. A star who wasn't just charming on screen, but grounded and responsible at home. But family life in Hollywood was rarely as smooth as it looked in magazines. Even when a household appeared polished, it could still be full of tension. Blended families weren't easy. Public attention made everything harder. And when a marriage is built under pressure, when the world expects perfection, every crack becomes dangerous. By many accounts, Van Johnson made sincere efforts to be supportive and involved. Yet over time, the strain grew. Not just from everyday relationship stress, but from something deeper, something the public couldn't see. Because in that era, Hollywood marriages weren't always about love. Sometimes they were about protection. And the more time passed, the more the fairy tale began to quietly unravel. By 1961, Van Johnson and Eve Abbott had separated. Not publicly dramatic, no screaming headlines, just a quiet fracture, like a door closing without a slam. Their separation wasn't immediately followed by divorce, partly because of the era's social conventions, and partly because their situation wasn't simple. It took 7 years. Not until 1968 did the marriage officially end, and by then, the studio system that once controlled every detail of Van Johnson's life was collapsing. The world was changing, Hollywood was changing, and the old rules were beginning to weaken. But that also meant something else. It meant all the secrets didn't stay buried as easily, because after the marriage ended, Eve Abbott would later make statements that recast their union in a far darker light. She claimed Van Johnson was gay and suggested their marriage had been orchestrated by MGM. A so-called lavender marriage meant to protect his career and preserve his wholesome appeal. And if that was true, then the wedding wasn't a love story. It was a performance, a carefully staged shield built by a studio that feared the truth more than anything. For decades, MGM sold Van Johnson to the world as the embodiment of wholesome American masculinity, the smile, the charm, the perfect romantic leading man. But behind that studio-created illusion, Van Johnson's private life was far more complex, shaped by secrecy, coded relationships, and the constant fear of being exposed in an era that treated homosexuality as a scandalous, dangerous, and career-ending. In the 1940s and 1950s, Hollywood didn't just discourage gay actors from living openly, it punished them. The strict morality clauses controlled stars like invisible handcuffs. The studios monitored social circles, friendships, appearances, even who you were seen having dinner with. One rumor could end a career overnight. And for someone as valuable as Van Johnson, the pressure wasn't just personal, it was corporate. He understood the rules because he had no choice but to live by them. Later in life, in rare private conversations, Van Johnson reportedly acknowledged what the studio system spent his entire career forcing him to deny. He hinted that he had romantic relationships with other men during the golden age of Hollywood, and even went further. He reportedly named names, not as gossip, not as a boast, but as a quiet confession from a man who had spent most of his life being told that the truth would destroy him. He admitted it plainly, almost painfully. I didn't have the luxury of being honest. In those days, honesty could destroy everything you worked for. Among the names attributed to Johnson was Montgomery Clift, another MGM star whose sensitive on-screen persona often masked deep personal turmoil off a screen. According to accounts linked to Johnson, the relationship between the two men was quiet, emotionally intense, and completely hidden from the public eye. Johnson allegedly said Monty was different. He felt everything deeply, so deeply it made him dangerous to himself and irresistible to others, and their connection, as later biographers suggested, wasn't casual. It was built on mutual recognition. Two men trapped by expectations they could never fully meet. Two men living inside carefully controlled images that had no room for who they truly were. Another name Johnson reportedly mentioned was Tab Hunter, a younger star who rose to fame in the 1950s and later confirmed his own homosexuality. Tab's career was shaped by the same studio cruelty. Forced publicity romances designed to keep the public convinced he was straight. Johnson reportedly described him as sweet, scared, and very young. And in a single sentence, he captured the tragedy of that whole era. We were all pretending, but he hated pretending the most. If a relationship between them existed, it would have been brief and hidden, shaped not by freedom, but by fear, because nothing about their world allowed anything honest to breathe. Then there was the name everyone recognizes when they think of Hollywood secrecy, Rock Hudson. Though no definitive proof exists that Van Johnson and Rock Hudson were romantically involved, Johnson reportedly spoke about how many actors in their circle shared similar hidden lives. Rock, he suggested, understood the rules better than anyone. You smiled, you dated who they told you to date, and you never slipped. Whether they were friends, confidants, or something more, they belonged to the same unspoken fraternity, men bound by silence, protected by performance, and haunted by the same question: what would happen if the world really knew? Van Johnson emphasized something that people often forget when they look back and treat these stories like scandal. These weren't casual affairs, they were emotional lifelines. We weren't sneaking around for thrills, he explained. We were trying to survive without losing ourselves completely. That was the reality. Meetings arranged through trusted intermediaries. Conversations held behind closed doors. A constant awareness that one wrong person, one loose whisper, one bad headline could turn everything to ash. And when he looked back at the Hollywood marriages of that era, including his own, Van Johnson reportedly spoke with a kind of exhausted clarity. Some people married for love, he said. Others married for protection. Sometimes it was both, but often it was neither. By the time he shared these reflections, he didn't seem interested in scandal anymore. He seemed interested in honesty, in telling the truth, even if it came too late to change his life. I don't regret the love, he reflected. I regret the fear. And in those words, you can almost hear it. The weight of decades spent living as a symbol while hiding the most human part of himself. By the time Van Johnson reached his later years, the world around him had changed. The rigid studio system that once controlled every detail of a star's life had weakened. The iron grip of morality clauses loosened. Hollywood itself began to look back, more honestly, more compassionately, at the people it once forced to hide. And that's where Van Johnson's Astoria starts to feel less like gossip and more like something deeply human. Because in his final reflections, he didn't speak like a man chasing attention. He spoke like someone trying to reclaim a piece of himself that had been locked away for decades. He believed the public deserved to understand how many lives were shaped and fractured by Hollywood's unyielding standards. That behind the glamorous facade of old Hollywood were real people forced to split their identities in half just to survive. And when he quietly acknowledged the men he loved in secret, it wasn't about naming names anymore. It was about finally telling the truth. His story, viewed through a broader lens today, becomes a reminder. The Golden Age wasn't only built on talent and elegance, it was also built on fear. Careers were protected by lies, lives were controlled by contracts, and entire generations were trained to believe that authenticity was too dangerous to risk. Then came the line that feels like a final confession and a final mourning. We were there, he said simply. We just weren't allowed to be seen. It's hard to hear that and not feel the weight of it, not only for Van Johnson, but for every actor who has smiled for the cameras while carrying a secret that could destroy them. By the early 1990s, after a career spanning decades, Van Johnson quietly stepped away from the spotlight for good. There was no dramatic farewell tour, no grand goodbye, just a soft retreat, like a man who had spent his whole life performing finally choosing silence on his own terms. He moved into a penthouse at 405 East 54th Street on Manhattan's East Side, a place that reflected both sophistication and solitude, away from studio publicity machines, away from the constant expectation to be Van Johnson for the world. In New York, surrounded by real city rhythms instead of artificial Hollywood light, he lived quietly, largely out of public view, content to let memory replace applause. But time always comes for everyone. As his health declined, he moved to Tappan Zee Manor, an assisted living facility in Nyack, New York, where he could receive the care he needed. Even then, those around him remembered him as dignified and gracious, almost gentle in his presence, a legendary figure living modest daily routines, as if fame had become something distant and unreal. Then, on December 12th, 2008, Van Johnson died at the age of 92. A life that had helped shape nearly a century of entertainment history came to a close, not with fireworks, but with quiet finality. His remains were cremated, a simple farewell for a man who had once been one of the brightest faces in America. And in the end, that simplicity feels meaningful, because Van Johnson's story isn't only about the films he made or the roles he played. It's about what he endured. a star who became an icon of warmth and optimism, while living inside a world that demanded he hide the truest parts of himself. A man who carried love in secrecy, survived fear with discipline, and only in the final chapters allowed himself to say what the world once refused to hear. And maybe that's his real legacy. Not just the smile, not just the movies, but the quiet courage of surviving an era that insisted he disappear behind a perfect mask. When the curtain finally fell on Van Johnson's life, there was no scandal. No shocking revelation splashed across headlines. No dramatic confession shouted into the public eye, and somehow that feels exactly right. Because Van Johnson was never allowed to live loudly as himself, so he chose to leave quietly. For decades, audiences remembered him as the smiling soldier, the loyal friend, the gentle romantic lead. Hollywood remembered him as a safe investment, a face that sold tickets, a symbol that never threatened the illusion. But history remembers more than images. It remembers what was taken. Van Johnson gave the world a comfort during its darkest years. He carried America's hope through wartime screens. He embodied kindness when the country needed reassurance. And in return, he was asked to sacrifice something no one should ever have to give up: his truth. When he finally looked back, he didn't speak with bitterness. He didn't accuse. He didn't seek revenge on the system that controlled him. What he expressed instead was something far more devastating: regret for the fear, not the love he felt, not the connections he made, but the fear that shaped every decision, the fear that dictated who he could be seen with, the fear that followed him even into marriage, fatherhood, and fame. His story forces an uncomfortable question onto the audience today. How many legends were built on silence? How many careers survived only because people erased themselves? And how many lives were quietly broken so Hollywood could appear perfect? Van Johnson wasn't alone. He was one of many. And that's why his final words echo far beyond his own life. We were there. We just weren't allowed to be seen. That sentence isn't just a memory, it's an accusation and a warning. Because behind every golden age, there are truths waiting to be acknowledged. And behind every perfect image, there's often a human cost we only understand too late. Van Johnson didn't live to see a world where he could be fully himself. But by allowing his story to surface, carefully, quietly, honestly, he reclaimed something Hollywood once took from him: his voice. And now the question is left with us. Will we remember him only for the smile, or will we finally see the man behind it?